and welcome to this week's Tuesday Techniques. A little bit later than advertised, but still better late than never. So today what I want to do is go through with you the next in our kind of installment of making our pattern adjustments. And so those of you that have seen these sessions before will know that these Tuesday techniques are designed to help you understand how you can make fitting adjustments to your sewing patterns. So we've been doing these over the last few weeks, and if you haven't seen the previous versions of these tutorials, then please head over to the So Much More Fun website. I can show you that here. So muchmorefun.co.uk, and make sure you check those out. If you go to the tips and tricks section, then you'll see in there a load of different information and links to some of the past Tuesday techniques sessions. So today what we're going to look at is building on where we've got to. So in the past few sessions, we've been looking at shoulder adjustments, we've looked at full bust adjustment, we've done broad and narrow back adjustment, and then last week we did my favourite, the rounded back adjustment, which I do on quite a lot of patterns. This is another common adjustment for me. So this is the kind of adding width to the upper arm here. So you can't tell in this shirt, but I am kind of quite fleshy in my upper arms, and some of that is a little bit of muscle, but some of it is not. So as we get older, this is an area where we sometimes can collect a bit more flesh, and so we maybe need to add some more room into our patterns to accommodate that in our sleeves. So in this session, we're just going to really look at how we adjust the upper arm area here to allow more room and more movement into the sleeve. So the way that you might know that you need this adjustment is that it's kind of pulling or it's tight across the sleeve here, or when you try and move your arm, it's too tight. There's not enough room for you to comfortably move your arm, or it feels like it's pulling across the back or maybe across the chest. Sometimes as you open your arms out, you may feel that it's pulling across the chest. You can't feel that so much on this top because it's a wrap top, but sometimes it can feel as if it's pulling a bit here. And often it's because if the sleeve is too tight, then what happens is that the arm is trying to borrow fabric from the actual bodice in some cases because there isn't enough room in the sleeve. And so you might find that that's a problem for you. So one of the things I want to do before we get started is to just cover a few basics of the kind of anatomy of a sleeve and how that works with the bodice, because when we make these adjustments, it's likely that we're going to need to not only adjust the sleeve pattern, but also make some adjustments to the armhole in the bodice, because the sleeve doesn't work in isolation. So we need to make sure we understand that combination. So the rule of thumb for woven garments, and we're mostly referring to woven. So there is a bit more leeway in a sleeve for a stretch or a knit pattern, but in this instance we're talking about woven garments. And the rule of thumb for a woven garment is that you need at least to be able to sort of pinch an inch on the top part of the sleeve, otherwise this is going to feel a bit too tight when you're wearing it. So you need a bit of room and a bit of movement, and as a guide you sort of need to be able to pinch out a bit of fabric here to allow you to do that if there's no stretch in the fabric itself. So let's have a little look at a pattern. I just want to talk you through a couple of the bits of the anatomy. So I'm just going to change my camera here. Okay, so hopefully you can see this okay. Just bring a bit more light onto it. Right, so I've got a sleeve cut out here. This is kind of about 3/4 scale, just so that we can see some of the details. And so on this sleeve, I don't know whether you can see that very well, but you'll notice that we've got the sort of head of the sleeve here, which is this rounded area. And then that leads into these sort of two pointy bits, which are the sections that go under the arm. And then you might notice there's a very small kind of single notch here on one side, and then two notches here on the other side. And then there's also a notch marked here at the top. So a single notch on a sleeve denotes the front of the sleeve. And the key thing to remember about sleeves is you have to make them in pairs. If you cut two out like this on your fabric face up, then you will end up with two sleeves that fit one side of your body. What you need to do is either fold your fabric and cut one of these with your fabric folded underneath, which will give you a pair, Or you need to make sure that you are, or you need to make sure, sorry, I just got a notification about something which I think is due later. Yeah, or you need to make sure that you are flipping the pattern over if you're cutting them kind of side by side. Okay, so what you'll also notice is, so the 2 notches denote the back of the sleeve and 1 notch denotes the front of the sleeve, and I'll explain that a bit more in a second. And then this denotes where the top of the sleeve is, so this would normally align with the shoulder seam that you've put into your bodice or your garment. Now, the reason for taking a bit of time to explain this is I want to show you kind of when we make an adjustment on a sleeve or when we're inserting a sleeve, how these bits then relate to the kind of pieces on your bodice pattern. All right. So on the bodice, this is the back of our bodice, and you'll see there's a corresponding set of 2 notches here for the back of the bodice. Now, the way that a sleeve is shaped is that this section here on the bottom part of the bodice, armhole, should correspond pretty well to the sleeve, to the shape here. Now, it's not great on this pattern, I'll be honest. If we put these over one another, they should match up a bit more closely than this one does, I would expect. This one doesn't quite match up perfectly. And then the same would apply for the front of the armhole. So again, this curve here should match the front of the bodice. And that's a bit closer. So that kind of sort of tracks the shape here. And these 2 sections, generally when you're inserting a sleeve, these 2 sections should be fairly flat. They should go quite well against the bodice section of the garment. The top of the sleeve, however, doesn't exactly match the kind of curve of the armhole. So as you can see, they don't really sort of go exactly together. There's a few reasons for this. So the first is that when we are sewing this in, we're actually going to sew at the seam allowance. So let's say our seam allowance is here. So our stitching line is going to be a bit further in from the edge. Okay. And so that's the line that we're going to sew, and that's going to kind of marry up with the equivalent line on the armhole. And you see, obviously, we're kind of bringing curves together that are 2 different shapes. And so also the other thing to think about is when we have folded our sleeve round and we've sewn our underarm seam, when we're joining it onto our bodice, you can see that the sort of section that we're joining, these are going to be kind of fairly well aligned. But you can see that here at the top, that where we're going to join the sleeve kind of goes upwards, but the shoulder that it's going into goes across. And so we need to do some work in the top of this section of the sleeve to sort of bend this over so that it will slot in. And there's ways of doing that using easing stitches around this top of the head of the sleeve. But what that means is that this curve is often bigger than the curve that we've got for the armhole. So that's the reason why I'm explaining that point, because if you were to measure this edge here and measure this edge at the top between the 2 notches, they won't match up. There will be a difference. This one should generally be bigger, usually by probably a couple of centimeters. And so when we start to make our adjustments, this will become important, and I'll tell you kind of how to compensate for that as we are making the adjustments to our sleeve. Okay, so one of the things that we need to do if we want to make our sleeve wider is generally the first thing we need to do is understand how wide the sleeve is and then how big our bicep is. And so for this particular adjustment, if you were going to take a measurement, let's just come back to have a look at you. There we go. So I'm just going to grab my tape measure out of my sewing box. So when we're measuring our sleeve, our bicep, then we're going to measure around the largest part. Now, it can be a bit tricky to do this on yourself, but if you just sort of wrap the tape measure around, and what you're really trying to get is the measure at the widest part. And if you are quite muscly, then you might want to tense up, because as you move your arm around, that might get bigger. So kind of put it on your arm, move your arm backwards and forwards, and make sure you've got enough room, and take the biggest measurement. So for me, it's about 12.5 inches. And so what we want to do is make sure that we've got enough room, plus our inch of ease, between our, kind of across this area here. This is the area where it's going to sit across your bicep, just under sort of where this underarm seam is here. Okay. And so let's say we've established that we need to add some room in that area. There are a couple of ways you can go about it. Now, depending on the size of the change that you want to make, again, I'm just going to go back to my other camera. Yeah, depending on the size of the change that you want to make, there's a couple of different ways you can make the adjustment. So I'm going to show you probably the simplest one that's great for a small change. And I say a small change is probably up to about 1 inch of difference. If you need to make more than that, then I would say you might need to combine this with another change that I'm going to also show you. So on our pattern, we would measure how much we needed. So we measure across here. This is at 3/4 scale, which is why it doesn't look very big, but we'd see how much we needed to change. And then what we're actually going to do is we're going to kind of open out the pattern here, but to get it to fit within the armhole shape that we've got here, we're going to try and keep this length at the head of the sleeve. We're going to try and keep this length the same. So the way that we're going to make this adjustment should allow that to happen. So we can draw a line across roughly just below kind of where our, on this pattern, it's actually marked where the bicep is. So this is the made to sew cotton pattern that I'm just using, which is a good sort of sloper or bodice pattern, dress pattern. So we will draw our line across here. And then I've got the grain line marked. I'm going to go kind of down the centre of the sleeve, and I'm going to just draw at right angles here, lining up with where the centre notch is. So I'm just going to draw here as well. Then I'm going to take my scissors, and what I want to do is cut inside these lines and leave some little hinges at the top and the bottom, and that will become clear why in a moment. So I'm just going to fold this over so I can do my first cut. And so I want to cut up through the pattern. Oops, get my scissors in. So I'm just cutting along that centre line, and I'm going to leave a hinge at the top, and then I'm going to cut down to the bottom, leave a hinge at the bottom. Then I'm going to cut outwards from the centre along my line, and then I'm going to do the same. I'm just going to stick a bit of tape on there so that bit doesn't fall off. Do the same along here. Okay, and so now what we want to do is, you can see it's already starting to happen. Can you see we can open this out a little bit now, and it will give us a bit more room across that middle of the sleeve and the upper arm. You'll also see that it's adding a little bit into the head of the arm as well. So again, the bit where it's sort of joined to the garment at the front and the back, it's going to add a tiny bit of extra here. Now, if you need a lot more in this area, there are other ways that we can make that modification. But generally, for the sort of smaller changes, this is a good quick sort of adjustment. So what I'm going to do is just grab a piece of paper. So the trick with this is it's a little bit tricky in that you need to sort of get it lined up. So I'm just going to draw a straight line across on here. So we've got a kind of reference point on my bit of paper underneath. And then you could also draw another line here. And then you could mark from there, depending on how big you want to make your increment. So let's say we're going to go, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch or something like that. Then we can do that. So we can open this out now. If I put this kind of with the in the center there, so it's sort of, I can just see through where the cross is. And then what I want to try and do, oops, if I can grab hold of it, is grab the two underarm pieces and just kind of pull out evenly away from that middle line. And I want to try and get, oops, I want to try and get these top bits to overlap. So can you see now? I don't know if you can see that very well. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit more. There we go. So you can see now I've got my original line, and then you can see that I'm pulling away from that center line. So if I go out a tiny bit further, then you can see it starts to add the extra in that we need, and we're starting to adjust the sort of head of the sleeve. And then we want to try and get this so that it will lie flat. So you sort of want to play around with this. I probably need to cut that a bit more at the top. But let's say that's our kind of adjustment there. And so all we've really done is added, I'll just stick a couple of bits on to hold it in place while I talk you through it. So what we've done is we've not changed the length at the top, but we have kind of flattened out this curve at the top, and that can cause problems. If you start to make this a lot bigger, then I'll show you another adjustment you might want to make. But you can see you can add a reasonable amount in here, and then this will give you that difference in the center of the sleeve. So hopefully this would be enough to accommodate the change that you made. Now, if this starts to drop a bit too low, what you can do is, if I grab another piece of paper, you can add that back in by putting your original sort of pattern on the top. So assuming that you trace this off, you can put the original pattern back over the top. Can you see the difference there now? Can you see how this is kind of widened out from the original pattern? But what we can do is just move this up, and then we could retrace the top to add back into the head of the sleeve if we were worried about the length that was going to give us, or the impact. Probably wouldn't add quite that much. Maybe go about halfway in between, depending on how much room you've got. And then practice that with your toile, and just see whether that makes the adjustments kind of wide enough for you. Let me come back and have a look at you. Okay, so what that allows you to do, like we said, is that will give you this extra width, but it's mostly going to be, if you look at the kind of anatomy of your sleeve, you can see here where that's going to come. So it's going to come quite far down on the arm of your sleeve, and that adjustment that's bringing the sleeve head down might potentially make this a bit tight at the top. So if when you've made the adjustment, you feel like you've not got enough room here, that's when you would go back and add a bit extra into the head of the sleeve. Now, if you have to add extra into the head of the sleeve, then you will need to make an adjustment on the bodice, and I'll show you that in a second. But this is quite a straightforward way. And like I say, if you're only making a small adjustment, say you just need an extra, it's just a little bit tight, you need an extra ½ inch, then this is a great quick way to just be able to add that extra in. There is an alternative way of making this change, and this would require you to make the change. This allows you to make maybe a slightly bigger change, and also make the change higher up. So if where you've got the problem is actually more kind of across this section of the sleeve, so maybe you've got quite a big really upper arm, then there is an alternative you can use to make a bigger adjustment. So let's have a look at that. So I should have said at the beginning, if you're making any of these kind of sleeve adjustments, I would always trace off your pattern and make sure that you can get back to your original. So if anything ever happens, then you've always got that to go back to. Plus, you can also reuse elements of the original, like the original curve of the sleeve head or the curve at the underarm, and then you can retrace those onto whatever your adjustments are. So with this kind of adjustment, I would say always take a copy of your sleeve pattern on some pattern paper, and we've got some videos again on how to trace off patterns on the website, so if you have a look at that. Okay, so the next method that I'm going to show you is similar to one of the ones that we used for making the back adjustment, and this is where we're going to take out a section of the sleeve, and we're going to move the area and increase the area where we actually need the adjustment. So if we go back to our sleeve pattern, just go back to my overhead really quickly if I can get my mouse to work. By the way, if you've got any questions, I can see a couple of you on live, then be sure to say hello and ask any questions. Thank you for being here, and it's great to see you. So this is our kind of copy of our sleeve, and hopefully you can see this okay. So in this case, what we're going to do is mark some lines onto the sleeve so that we can actually make the adjustment at the places where we want to make it. And we're going to kind of cut a section out and slide it in or out, and then amend sleeve kind of profile based on that. So in this example, what I'm going to do is if we, I'll just quickly draw my, so if this is my grain line, let's get this lined up. Okay, so I'm going to draw a line. So this is where my notch is. So this is my kind of front notch and my back notch. And so I want to make this adjustment where we're going to add more kind of into this upper section of the sleeve. So we're going to add it in the kind of this area here. So I'm going to draw a couple of lines in to the side of the sleeve. And I'm going to make them parallel with the, so I'm using my gridded ruler to make them parallel with the grain line. So I'm just going to draw these in. So draw our 2 lines in, and then we decide where we need the adjustment. So I'm going to make the adjustment above, starting above the notches. So we're going to start about here. And again, I'm just drawing a line now at right angles to those lines I've drawn. And then I'm also going to make, I'm going to carry that adjustment down into the sort of upper bicep area. So I'm going to bring it down to here. Okay, so in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to keep the sleeve as it was in terms of the main part of the sleeve. And then we're just going to work with these 2 kind of subsections here that we've got marked out. So if I want to add in some width, then what I can do is cut my subsection here. Oops. There we go. And I could do the same on the back piece. And can you see now that I can slide this in and out? And then this will add whatever width I need at the front or the back. What I like about this method is it gives you a bit of flexibility. So if your flesh isn't evenly distributed around your arm and you do need more in the front or the back, then potentially you could make these adjustments independently. Whereas with the other pattern adjustment, it's kind of, you need to do that in the center and it's going to balance that out evenly across the sleeve. Now, generally, you would want to try and make it fairly even because that will keep the pitch of the sleeve okay. But you may, it gives you a chance to kind of experiment with that if you do have that requirement. So in this case, what we're doing is we are adding width kind of further up in the sleeve. So this is really kind of at the sleeve head. So we get a bit more room across that very upper arm. And then we're adding width at the bottom as well. So if I just stick that down there for a second. But what you will also notice, the observant ones amongst you, is that we have a kind of a junction here where it's got a bit funny. And also we've got this to sort of deal with at the side here as well. So we're actually going to be adding length onto this curve here. So we're going to need to make a similar adjustment into the armhole. So what we can do is we can smooth out this curve and then sort of redraw the top of the curve there. And generally, when I'm making this kind of adjustment, I would be kind of taking about halfway the difference between the 2. So if I grab a piece of paper, and if you're not comfortable with freehanding, then you can kind of use your curves or those sorts of things. But if I just get another different coloured pen. So in this instance, I would be taking kind of halfway here and blending it into the top and then down to where my notches are. So I'm adding a little bit on and taking a little bit off. So that's not really going to add a significant amount, but where we're adding here, this is going to add a significant amount to the side seam. So we'll need to put this back on at the side seam as well. So whatever this distance is that you've come out, then we will want to add a similar amount on to the side seam. I'll show you that in a second. But it's quite an easy adjustment to make. So then at the side, at the underarm here on the sleeve, what we would do then is blend this back in, going down as far as you can really to sort of blend it with the rest of the pattern and redraw that line. So again, this is going to give you extra kind of all the way down the width. Now, if you need to make a really big adjustment here, what you can also do, if you've got quite more fleshy upper arms, then you might see on some patterns this isn't a straight line. So you can also make this more of a curved line. That's probably a bit too exaggerated, but you get the idea. So you can add a bit more room under the sleeve if that's where, say, you've got more fleshy triceps or kind of the back of the arm, bingo wing type shape. Then you can also shape this underarm seam as well if you need to do that. So you can play and experiment with that. So in this instance, we wouldn't need to, what I like about this adjustment as well is you don't need to change the notches on your sleeve, on your armhole pattern. But what you might want to do is extend the length above and below the bottom of the sleeve. So let's have a bit of a look at that on the front bodice. So in this case, this is our front bodice pattern. And so the front and the back would be the same, depending on how you've made your adjustment. So however much you've added on here, you're going to need to make the same adjustment to the length of the armhole here. So we're going to need to bring this out by that same amount and then blend that down. Now, in this case, we've got a bust dart. And so you'd have to fold out your bust dart. I don't know which size I've got. Oh, this one here. I'll just do that. So you would, so this seems a bit overkill, but you would fold out your bust dart because you want to get the straight line down the side seam. Okay, so you would add on your extra and then you would blend down all the way down kind of as early as you can, really, because you're not trying to add more into your bust area. So you sort of want to blend this back in. To add the extra into the length, but that means then that this length will then match up. But what you'll notice here is that these notches may not now match. So you'll just want to double check again the position of your notches, and you can do that by laying this, kind of truing up these patterns and just making sure. So can you see that the notch on the sleeve is here, but the notch on the armhole is here. So you might just want to decide which one you want to keep. So I might move my notch on my sleeve to here. And this will become my new notch. Hopefully you can see that detail. Okay, so that's just a really basic introduction to how you can start to add width into the sleeve. There are lots of other sleeve adjustments that we can do, and if there's anything particular that you have struggled with on sleeves, then please let me know and we can kind of plan that into doing these Tuesday techniques. So Mum says, I need to make a sleeve adjustment on the majority of patterns. Once you've made the right sleeve adjustment on one pattern, could you use that as a template for others? Yeah. So once you've got an armhole shape that fits you, and once you've then got a sleeve that fits into there, then you can definitely use that as a template on other patterns. So you can use it either just to sense check what the other pattern looks like, or you can actually trace it off. So the markers that I would use to line that up are, make sure it's aligned at the center front, and then check the kind of position relative to the shoulder on the garment that you're using. And it might be that you want to change the pitch of the shoulder to match the sleeve and the armhole shape that you're putting in. And then on the sleeve itself, I would just try and use the same sleeve. So if you get a sleeve that works for you, then yeah, you can then reuse that sleeve into that armhole. I was going to say something else on that, and it's gone out of my head. So yeah, but you can. What was I going to say? Yeah. So again, just talking about the anatomy of the sleeve as well. A couple of things to think about. The pitch of the sleeve will be different. So if you start to make adjustments, we haven't done the video yet on how to do a forward shoulder adjustment. But one of the things that you would want to think about if you're making a forward shoulder adjustment, for example, is the position of this top notch here. And there are adjustments that we can make, which I'll go through when we do that session, about how to change the pitch of the sleeve if you've had to move the shoulder position forward as well, so that it hangs nice and straight. But we won't, it's a bit too much to go into today. But that's, again, another thing to think about when you are deciding on kind of how your sleeve is fitting. And yeah, so hopefully this has given you some ideas of how you can make the adjustment. And And there are some common themes here in terms of the adjustments that we made on the back, the adjustments that we've made on the sleeve. You can use some of these techniques. I really like this sliding technique where you can kind of extract a section that you want to work with, and then just think about how that changes the sort of the positioning of the items that it's going to match up with. In this case, you would also probably want to mark where your stitch line is and just double check the measurement and make sure you've still got enough ease within the sleeve, and then you might also want to make an adjustment if you are lengthening this section of the sleeve. Then you may need to add some extra into at the shoulder point here for it to go into. So just be thinking about that as well. But if you've got any specific instances that you want any help with, then let me know. You can let me know either on the comments on the Facebook Lives, or you can message me or email me at hello@somuchmorefun.co.uk. This session has been about making a sleeve wider, and if you have any other particular sleeve adjustments that you'd like me to tackle, then I'd love to know, and we can go through those in more detail. I'll put some links underneath as well as to some other resources that you can use for checking out how to make sleeve adjustments, and if there's any specific questions I can help you with, then just shout out. So for next time, we're going to be looking at tummy adjustments. And so again, this can be quite a common one, particularly on fitted skirts or dresses. So I'm going to show you a few tips on how you can add a bit more room for a tummy. But that's it for this week, and thank you to everyone that joined, and I'll catch up with you again soon. Bye for now.